Welcome to episode 6 of the Urban Amish Show. In this episode, I'm joined by my wife of 21 years, Mary June, to talk about how to implement sustained change in our lives, lasting change that leads to personal growth, transformation, and a stronger foundation on which to build our future. We both know what it's like to try and fail to change our habits and our thinking, and we have also learned what it takes to make these changes stick. One of the changes I want to make in my life is to create and publish these episodes on a more regular basis. For as long as I've known that I have something to say, I've also faced resistance in my creative endeavors. Some of you will know what I'm talking about. We can be our own worst critic and our own worst enemy, trapped by what Stephen Pressfield calls resistance. One thing Pressfield says about resistance in his excellent book, The War of Art, is that resistance can be used as a navigational beacon. Resistance is so resolutely opposed to us producing what we are called to produce that we can actually reverse engineer it and allow it to point us towards our calling. The thing we are most afraid of is the thing we must face in order to move forward. I have certainly found that to be true in my life. Let's face it, it's impossible to hide the fact that there's a 3-month gap between episodes 4 and 5 of this show. That's resistance. But the only way through our fears and our resistance is, well, through them. So here we go. In this episode, Mary June tells the story of how she was violently attacked in an attempted robbery and how she used that fear and trauma in her own personal journey as fuel to move her towards love and into greater service for those around her. She trained for a marathon and raised tens of thousands of dollars to support a cause very dear to her heart. You don't want to miss this story. Since this episode was recorded, Mary June and I have started our second round of 75 Hard, a mental toughness challenge developed by Andy Frisella. For 75 days in a row, we've committed to a set of daily tasks that are transformative and tough. 2 workouts a day, at least 45 minutes in length. One of them has to be outside. Read 10 pages of nonfiction in a real physical book, follow a diet, drink a gallon of water, take a progress picture, no alcohol, no cheat meals, nothing. For my second journey through 75 Hard, I've added the additional requirement of no social media, except YouTube. As I record this, I've completed day 10 of 75, and I'm amazed to be reminded of how much clarity this program brings to my life. If you want to find out what issues you have hidden away in the fog of your unconscious mind, just drop yourself into this crucible and start paying attention. What you see will take your breath away. As your host, my role is one of player-coach. I'm in this game with you, and I'm paying attention to what works and what doesn't, and I report back to you, hopefully giving you some valuable insights that you can use to improve your own health and fitness, your marriage, your parenting, your career, or whatever it is that you're working to improve in your life. If you find this useful, please comment below and let me know. Share this with someone else who might enjoy it, and make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or here on YouTube. So, without further ado, here's episode 6. Welcome back to the Urban Amish Show, episode 6. Patrick Miller here, your host. I have a special guest with me, my lovely wife, Mary June. Welcome to the Urban Amish Show, Mary June.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here. I think I'm not the only one that's glad that you're here. I think our audience is glad that you're here too.
Thank you.
Yep. So today, as we talked about, we're going to talk about personal growth and transformation. In other words, how do we move from our present state to some future desired state? How do we identify what it is that's making our present state undesirable or painful or causing suffering into some desired future state where we are either healthier, wealthier, or wiser than we were, perhaps. So this is something that you and I have learned a bit about, yes?
I would say so.
So when was it? About 5 years ago when we first started having the conversation where I said to you, I said something like, there's so many things about me that I feel need to change that are not as they should be. I was probably 41 when I started having that realization.
Do you remember where we were?
Yeah, we were driving home from family holiday, Christmas, driving down the interstate, hour after hour of windshield time, and we get to talking, and we start talking about life and...
It's raining.
Oh, it's raining.
Which is a great gift.
I know. We've been wanting rain for so long. I was like, is it raining? Oh, sorry about the interruption there. It's just
We're excited.
I heard the raindrops pitter-pattering against the window, and I was kind of giddy.
Yeah, we were driving down the interstate, and I remember that question.
What was the question I asked you?
Well, I don't remember probably word for word, but something along those lines, like, how do I
think I said something like, have you ever noticed that there's so much about you that you'd like to change, but you don't know where to start? So that's kind of what we want to talk about today is if you have some things you want to change in your life, or there's some things that cause you suffering, or there's some relationships that aren't set up the way that you'd like them, the dynamics are difficult. The good news is that in many cases, there's something that you can do about it. And some people won't like to hear that. In fact, I didn't like to hear that at first too, because if there's something that I can do about it, that means that, well, there's a responsibility there.
You got to take responsibility. And
easier to blame
as a disclaimer, when you start doing the work, more work shows up.
Yeah. So you find out something that needs to change, and then you change it, and they're like, oh, that other thing too. When did you notice that? Like, tell me a little bit about your... So after we had that conversation, was that a new idea? Like, oh, what's Patrick thinking? Tell me how that hit you.
Well, I remember being curious about it, but when I think about like parts of myself that I have wanted to change or grow in, I actually go back a little further personally. Less awareness. I feel like my awareness of all of it has kind of amped up as we've been on this path the past 5 years. But I remember an incident that happened in Vegas, a very painful incident that happened in Vegas for me in 2007 that woke me up to some things, and I started running.
Let's just take a moment to share a brief snippet of what happened there, and why did you start running?
Okay. So we were in Vegas on a business trip with Patrick's work at that time, and we're getting ready to go out for the evening. I think this was like day 1 or 2 of like a 5 or 6 day trip. First time in Vegas for me. Kids were with grandparents, and it was a lovely evening. We dressed up, we went out, and ended up through a series of events. Patrick had to run back in because he forgot something in the hotel room, and I ended up being mugged in broad daylight in Vegas. And
standing outside the hotel.
Standing outside, yeah.
Guys walk up and try to steal your purse. You get into an altercation. I walk out, and they're beating the crap out of you.
Right.
And then, yeah, so you were assaulted, and I walked up on it and saw you get beat up. I tried to grab the guys. And so they ran away. I wasn't able to catch them, and as far as we know, nobody ever caught them.
But it was caught on hotel security cameras and all of that. And but having said all of that I remember there's a few things that I remember about that. One of them being that I realized I was blissfully naive in a lot of things, in a lot of ways, and it was a beautiful, in some ways, way to live because I didn't experience fear or anxiety almost at all.
Yep.
And so now I had this huge amount of anxiety. I was a mom to 3 young kids at the time. Going away was so scary, and I did not like how I felt. And I also realized that part of the reason that I was an easy target is because I was naive in my way of thinking about some things. And so one of the things I did to try to overcome this fear was to start running. And I look back at that as not very intense compared to what we've experienced over the last 5 years. But I remember experiencing enough of change in myself that running led me to run marathons. It led me to organize a team where we earned a vehicle we earned enough money to buy one of my brothers who's in a wheelchair a vehicle. And I just started seeing growth in ways that I look back at that experience and realize that was kind of the catapult for those sorts of things. I started working out, which I'd never done. Like I'd never set foot in a gym with weights, and I hired a personal trainer, all of those things. So yeah, that's kind of where I go back to when I think of an incident or a time in my life where I started to realize that there were things about me that could change.
That's the thing that I think when I look back at our journey, one of the things that stands out to me is before we could engage in a kind of growth trajectory, before we could step into growth, we had to become aware that growth was required, that growth was possible, and that we were someone who could change. I think a lot of us are asleep to that. It's easier, certainly it's easier to just kind of blame, the stuff out there for my suffering. If things aren't the way that I wish they were in some area of my life, whether it's my health or my, relationships or my job or mindset or my relationship with my kids or whatever it is, it's just easier to just, there's these things that are happening and it's somebody else's fault or it's maybe just the situation I'm in. But discovering that there is something that you can do and that kind of calls to you, and there's something beautiful about that, but it's also frightening too, because it's like, ugh, who wants to discover what that is? It's like, ugh. So I remember just now sitting here, I hadn't thought of this in a while, but I remember that transformation in you of becoming, you mentioned that you were naive, and that probably came in, you grew up in a very idyllic kind of small town, living on a farm, that rural Americana, even the Amish part of it, Amish Mennonite. It's like there's a naivete that is easy to protect in that kind of environment, that when you're out on the mean streets of Vegas, that doesn't really serve you that well. It would have been helpful for you to have some context for what could happen out there.
Well, and that's a really it's a tension, because it's like, I am grateful that I didn't have to grow up in a childhood where I had to be scared of something
Right.
behind every corner, right? Like it was idyllic. Like that's what was beautiful about it. And yet part of growing up is realizing or wrestling with that while yet not letting fear grip you. And that's what, after that experience, was so disorienting for me. It was like, I didn't like how I felt. Even though I was grateful for not being as naive, I didn't like how it felt to be fearful. Mm-hmm. And it's it's kind of what spurred me into going, okay, well, how can I at least not be fearful and still be more aware and not as naive?
Yeah. And watching you go on that journey, just thinking back to it, was something that kind of challenged me, because at the time I was probably reaching my peak weight, the baby weight gain that I gained weight when you got pregnant, times 4. And at this point,
he's such a great partner.
Very supportive.
Very supportive. If you're going to gain weight, I'll gain weight with you.
Just like, it's like, try to be like Jesus. I enter into your suffering with you, But then after Bridget, our youngest, was born, you started confronting these fears. And it was cool to see you. You started, tell me how remind me the connection between the running and the I don't like being afraid thing. So what was that about?
So the attack happened from my back. I had become uncomfortable with the conversation that these guys, it was 2 guys, were having with me, and I decided to try to walk back into the hotel. And so I walked back up to the doors, and that's when they attacked me. So it came from my back. So I started realizing, when I got brave enough to go back out on my own, that often I would have a flashback or a small panic attack when I felt like my back was open, like in Target or out in a parking lot. And so I started to try to think about what I could do to put myself into that situation more. And running the roads, like all of my training from that first marathon was, running the roads. I didn't run on a treadmill. And most of the training of that first marathon was in tears. Like I would often go out, and especially on those long runs, it was on a Sunday afternoon, and like teenagers do, there might be a car full of teens that would go by and holler or whatever, and it would just trigger that. And it gave me the opportunity to kind of walk through that fear again. But I was trying to put myself into situations where my back was exposed, and I had to face that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because now we have become pretty aware of the pattern that says you need to confront your fears, you need to face your fears. At the time, back in 2007, that wasn't a concept that we had made explicit to ourselves.
Right.
Like, we hadn't noticed that.
Right.
But you had, in some ways, noticed it subconsciously. You knew that if you were going to not be afraid, that you had to face that, and you had to expose yourself voluntarily to that trigger,
right,
until you became braver and braver and braver. And so
I was turning 30 in
you
2009.
were turning 30.
So it was like, and I remember thinking when I had my 30th birthday, like, if I keep feeling this sort of fear, I'm going to become an old person with lots of fears, because it started, well, like fear does, it grows. If you don't confront it, it'll just keep growing. So I became more and more afraid of things, and I just did not like how that felt.
Mm-hmm. I remember when you started going running, I think you just looked up, you said, hey, I need to run. And I remember you said something like, I need something bigger than myself to run for. I need something outside of myself, a goal, some transcendent, higher than me goal that is going to be what I cling to when I am out there running and I get, a panic attack comes and I feel afraid. I need something higher to aim at. And what was that for you?
So for me, that was my brother. I have two brothers in a wheelchair. My oldest brother,
They're
John,
not in the same wheelchair. They each have a wheelchair.
They each have their own wheelchair.
It's funny. It's kind of a Dumb and Dumber picture, but they're smart and smarter.
They are smart and smarter, and John and Chris would totally get the humor. My oldest brother in a wheelchair was having his 16th birthday. I'm trying to think. So he would have been, or maybe he was already 16, but he was getting to the point where if he was going to get his driver's license, we knew that a vehicle for him was going to cost more than just a regular vehicle, because it was going to have to be newer. It was going to have to be renovated in a way where his chair could come in, like a handicap renovation. And so I thought, well, how cool would it be if I gather a team together and we run and we raise money for it, like, what do you call it, like sponsorships or whatever, which I did. And there was a team of, oh gosh, I forget now. We called it Run to Drive, and we made t-shirts and we ran and we all raised money. And then the community actually gathered around us, and there was a family in the community that took it on and also did like a massive auction,
like a fundraising
auction. And we raised, through the race and the auction, we raised like $45,000, $50,000 for him to buy a van, brand new, off the lot, have it renovated, and he still drives it to this day.
Yeah. And listeners of the Urban Amish Show who listened to our last episode 5, will remember that John, MJ's brother John, was our guest on episode 5. He talked about suffering well and all of that. It's a great episode. Go check it out.
But yes, so I knew if I was going to do something like this, that in order, so Bridget was born in February, and I knew that if I was going to run my first marathon in November, which I'd never run before that in my life, that I was going to need something bigger than myself. And so I have a first cousin who is an ultra runner. And so I called Jason up and I said, hey, like, how crazy am I? What do I need to do? And he just like blew wind in my sails. He was like, go for it, do this. And I think he's the one that sent me, and my mind is blank right now on who the guy is. I think his last name starts with an H. I just printed out like a kind of training plan.
Couch to marathon training plan.
Right. And followed that pretty religiously. I went as quick as I could. I think I gave Bridget 6 weeks, or I was 6, when Bridget was 6 weeks old is when I started running.
Yep. So you became a runner and you ran a marathon all within the space of what, 9, 10 months?
6 months or so, from March to November.
Yeah. And you did that to confront your fears, and you raised money, which is what a cool story. Instead of causing you to shrivel up and in fear and stay in your home, you went out and you faced your fears, you got the exercise you wanted, you accomplished something, you put together a team, you rallied people around someone in need, you raised money. I mean, the goodness of that is just, it's awesome. So I think that is an example of how when we handle our fears the right way, when we face them, there's so much good that can come from that. And I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about personal transformation and personal growth is when we discover that we are someone who can change into more of who we were created to be. And when we then begin to notice what the patterns are in our life that maybe we hadn't noticed before that are holding us back, are causing us to act in fear, or are making the relationships around us not work. A lot of that's subconscious to us, and we don't have an awareness of it. But when you start to see it, I think that's the question the question that pops into my mind is, well, when you see the thing, how is it that you change it long term? Because we've all struggled with changing things in our life and then failing.
Right.
And then starting over and failing. I did that with my weight for a long time. You know that. How long did I battle my weight? Well, most of our married life.
Well, I think, and even before, like you have stories of
as a teenager, but like as an adult, we got married. You know, we've been married for 20 years, and I'd say for 17 years of that, I really struggled to keep my weight under control. It was just constant. I'd start a new diet, I'd start a new exercise routine, and in anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, it was done, and I was off. Back up to my weight, and it just so I couldn't find whatever was within me to affect the sustained change that I wanted. So that's the thing I wanted to talk about today is how do I identify those things? And then how do we lay out a plan and put together a successful effort to bring about this change and then to keep that change, to make that a part of our life? I'd like to talk about some specific examples of things that we've tackled individually and as a couple. And then maybe we can just brainstorm about what some of those things are that we've been able to identify as key aspects of transformation.
Okay. Can I just interject one part here? Because I think part of the important part of even talking about this is that how do we become aware? Like maybe weight gain is something that feels obvious, right? Like we feel like we know when we're overweight or when there's something like that. But I feel like there's even things that we've been able to transform that may not be as easy for humans to recognize as suffering in their lives, especially if it's something that you've told yourself is you for years. And I remember a podcast episode that I listened to from Dr. Jordan Peterson, which again, we talk about him a lot, or you talk about him a lot on this show. Instrumental in this part of our lives.
For sure.
And he talked about how it's a good thing that most of our life is lived in subconscious. Mm-hmm. Like it would be exhausting to live fully conscious of every single thing that goes on. I mean, it's hard to talk about even everything that goes on, from the breath to the, all of the parts of us that are just subconscious. We're subconsciously kind of living, but that can, and he talked about it in the example of when a teenager learns to drive a car, you think about from jumping into the car and turning that ignition to putting it in reverse. Like everything is so, like you're just so high alert. You're very aware of everything. Now I can do that, drive down the road and be on my phone, and it's so subconscious.
Not that you recommend.
Not that I recommend it, but it's so subconscious. Like I know how the car feels when I'm going around a corner. I can even drive in subconscious. I can drive while listening to a podcast and be thinking about what the podcast is telling me while I'm driving and know where I'm going. All of those things become subconscious. And so how do we, in order to change, we have to become aware and make that subconscious conscious again.
Yes.
In order to change it. And that's sometimes the biggest, like the hardest part is like, how do you become aware that what you don't like in life may be this, right, or maybe that, or the reason that I'm having this stuck mindset is because of this part of my life. And I mean, it's like it's identifying those things before we can change them, right?
It makes sense if you think about what your consciousness really is. It's if you divide your consciousness up into, well, conscious and subconscious elements, things like, well, the parts of your brain and your mind that control your breathing, your heart rate, when you start to sweat, all that's all subconscious. You don't really have any, I mean, you can control some of that consciously if you choose to, but mostly that's unconscious or subconscious, or actually unconscious or subconscious. I don't know.
I think
you're unconscious of it. So it's in your subconscious. And as I think it's Dr. Peterson that talks about the idea that which is new, that which presents itself as something new information, or when you, as you pointed out, when you're learning something new, that's when your consciousness is really engaged.
Right.
And the role of your conscious mind is to learn and then adapt and then help you make the parts of that new thing that are going to repeat as a pattern in your life, relegate that to the subconscious machinery, equipment in your mind, so that that's freed up then to deal with the new things that you're dealing with now. And so it's good that these things are relegated to the subconscious. That also means that most of the results in our life, from our health and fitness to our wealth to our mindsets, our relationships, our peace, our anxiety, most of that is a result of subconscious processes that we're unconscious of. We don't notice that the results that we're getting are a result of patterns that have been either handed to us or that we have adapted to as a result of things that have happened to us in the past, either good or bad. And these patterns in our life, I'm a big believer in, life is what repeats. It's like our life is not made of new moments for the most part. It's mostly what you do over and over again.
Correct.
And most of your body composition and fitness and health, it comes from what you do most of the time. You know, it's like the 80-20 rule. It's 80% of your, or 20, what is that? 20% of your inputs, let's say, control 80% of your outcomes. So it's, or am I thinking about that the right way? Not sure. Life is what repeats. And so becoming conscious of what it is that repeats, that's what you're talking about.
Right.
Like, what are the patterns that I'm engaged in that are causing these outcomes that I've determined are not helpful or not aligned with what I want them to be? They're not part of my vision moving forward. Right. So it's becoming aware that I'm someone who has subconscious patterns, becoming aware that I can identify them, and then going about the work of identifying them, then, well, setting a plan in place to change them. So what are some ways that you've experienced that, of like noticing what the patterns are that repeat that you would like to change?
Well, like I talked about with the Vegas experience, is as I started running, I started realizing how weak my muscular system was. And I started realizing and feeling how different I felt as I started getting stronger in that area. So for me, that was one way, was like, it made me curious about, well, okay, if I can run a marathon in 6 months, what else can I do? What have I not been doing that I could do? What has, and so that was one area for me. But I'm sure we'll talk as well about mindset. I feel like for me, my thinking through my mindset patterns, a lot of that has even come about by being in community or being in relationships, like with you. And when you're in a relationship and you get to be vulnerable with each other, you get to help each other notice some of those patterns that maybe are blind spots for yourself, because you've become so comfortable with them that they do feel true to you or feel like they're a real part of you. And sometimes it's actually painful to let go of them. Like Bridget came home from school or from a volleyball camp last week, and the coach there was, I thought was so beautiful, was able to talk to these middle school girls and talk to them about their mindset. And one statistic that he gave that she brought back home that she was surprised about is that most girls from a very young age think at least 4 negative thoughts about themselves every day. And I feel like that number's low when I started to think about it. But when I thought about like what some of the negative things are that I even say to myself, like, well, in some ways it kind of feels good. Or like you said, it kind of keeps me from having to take responsibility about a certain thought pattern or a certain thing. So if I can just kind of think negatively about it or blame something else, or then I don't have to take responsibility.
It's like the story that you tell yourself about the thing that's wrong.
Right.
In that story is embedded someone who's to blame, someone who's the victim, someone who's the hero. All the aspects of narrative are right there. And so sometimes just that simple shift of, well, maybe I'm not the victim. Maybe I can take responsibility for a part of this, and maybe there's something I can do. But it's actually pretty hopeful.
It is hopeful,
right? Because
right?
if it's someone else just doing things to you, it's like, what are you going to do about that exactly?
Right.
But if you have something that you can do to make things better, well, now you have something you can do, and you have something you can focus on, and you're not just left with trying to live out your life, medicating away the pain of realizing that there's nothing you can do about that.
Right.
You mentioned something that I want to dig into a little bit. You said being in relationship is one of the aspects that help us notice patterns, subconscious patterns. And I think that's something that, especially marriage, a marriage relationship, or I think parent-child can do this too, but a marriage relationship is really, I think the intimacy of that is so helpful in, if we're humble and we open ourselves up to each other, the other one calls out the best. We call out the best from each other,
right?
And I'm sure we bring out the worst in each other too.
Well, and even though it can feel sometimes like your partner is like just pointing out, like just picking on you, or I think the key there is to lay down any kind of competition and believe that you're for each other.
Truly for each other. Truly
for each other. And in that place, when you come to me and point something out, even if in the moment I can be, I can come back with a smart comment or whatever, I still think about that. Like, okay, yeah, he's right. And we help each other with that. And I feel like we're at a better place in that area than we've been ever. But I know that there are areas of my way of being that you've been able to go like, are you sure that's serving you well right now? And then it's my responsibility to either let it go or keep wallowing around in it, or stay stuck.
I think it was Carl Jung who said this, and I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't know the exact phrase, but he said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. Okay. And that kind of goes back to that idea that most of the outcomes in our life come about as a result of processes that are hidden from us. Mm-hmm. And like you pointed out a little bit ago, we can pull those things up out of the muck of the subconscious and actually bring them up, identify them, name them. And the biblical language, the Bible talks about transformation as a process of there's a confession. You name what it is that's wrong, and then you speak it out, and there's a repentance, which is a
metanoia.
There's this like, I see how that is not good for me. I can be sad about the way that hurts me, and I'm hopeful about the new mode of being that I want to inhabit, or that I am called to inhabit. And there's a transformational, there's a healing of the mind. There's a new way of thinking, right? So it's like I've named the old thing, and I've allowed my mind to picture a new future state that's more, well, in the biblical language, we'd say it's more like God. It's more aligned with God and where God's calling us to. So that confession and repentance language, or naming the thing and then allowing our laying down the pride that keeps our perception so strict and fixed, allowing that to break open and picturing a new reality that's free from this thing, and then having the faith to live into that reality. I think that's kind of breaking all of that down, making the unconscious known and naming it, identifying it, pulling it up out of the cloudy, mucky darkness that, you just can't see into that well. So being in relationships a huge part of that. Go ahead.
Well, and I think one key part of what we've been experiencing over the past 5 years is in that process, not going to shame about these things. Because I think so often when we're sometimes conditioned to believe that in order to change something, we have to just like shame it or hate it, and that's what's going to change it. And it's really not that at all.
Mm-hmm. It's maybe if I can beat myself up about that, I'll stop doing that.
Which I think honestly, part of your, back to the weight thing, part of your failure in some of that was because you did. Like that was kind of like you would just get to this point and you would beat yourself up or you would hate yourself about it enough to motivate some sort of change, but it wasn't lasting.
Right.
So I hope you get to talk about your transformation, because you really aren't the same person you were 5 years ago. I don't think either one of us are, but that I feel like has been a big part of it is just rejecting, like the confession, repentance in my mind used to be shrouded with shame as kind of the motivator in the past. And that doesn't seem to bring about the change that we're talking about.
Right. So I think so what changed for me was, instead of shame being the motivator, love became the motivator. There was this, God broke through to me and I began to see that love was higher than, more powerful than shame. And that love for God, that receiving God's love and the truth of what he said about me kind of settled into me, I guess is one way to think about it. But it's like, oh, you're saying I could be this new way? I could be in this, I could have this mode of being that I'm not familiar with now. I could be free from that destructive behavior, that compulsion, that addiction, that sin. I could be free from that. It's like imagining a new reality that is free from that. That was a transformative day for me. And you know that day. You know when that happened. And it's like once that starts to drop away, once you start to live into, well, I can be free from it today. I'm free from it right now. And it's like it builds on itself, and the love pulls you forward, and you begin to see it builds this kind of evidence within itself when you trust into it and live into it. But I think going back to the relational aspect of discovering that what the patterns are that hurt us, I think I want to spend a little bit of time there, because I know couples who might hear that might cringe and go, well, I don't want my partner, my spouse, to point out to me something that they think I'm doing that's hurting me. And I want to be careful there, because that can be, there's relationships where it's not safe to do that emotionally. And I think we have had to work on building the kind of container that's safe to have those conversations. And one of the not early, but a couple of years ago, you came to me and you'd been learning some things about the reality of masculine and feminine energy, and the extent to which we both carry, as men and women, masculine and feminine aspects, images of God. And many times the masculine aspects are kind of mapped onto the male and the male's role in the relationship, and the feminine energies are mapped onto the woman and her roles in the relationship. But sometimes those can get switched around. Sometimes the man is living out of a more feminine essence, and the woman is living out of a more masculine essence. And you begin to be aware of all of that. And I think these are patterns that when you become aware of them, they're kind of self-evident. You see them all through, reality. But you certainly see them in relationship dynamics. So, when you think of just what are some of the feminine aspects of the feminine essence that you think of?
More fluid, more chaotic, more unorganized,
A little more sense of flow.
more and you can see it all the way down to like we have monthly cycles. We have our hormones are a little more like up and down with our cycles, and the way true feminine embodiment looks is more fluid and more curvy and it is more chaotic.
Yep.
And then the masculine is more grounded and more structured and
More
more
rigid.
organized, more rigid.
The masculine side of things is the one who's planning and doing and grasping and getting and
Right.
providing and all of that. The feminine is receiving, is flowing, and it's the ocean. It's the push and pull of the tides coming and going, and
Right. And then the masculine more the ocean floor.
It's the grounded.
Yeah.
Yes, and so many times we're unaware by default what patterns are prominent in our life. And you began to read about this and do the work and understand where you were in relation to those kind of archetypes, let's say. And you came to me and you said, this is great. You said, so I want to tell you a little bit about masculine and feminine energy. And you explained to me how this works. And you explained to me how that in a healthy relationship dynamic, there's polarity. There's a push and a pull, like opposite ends of a battery, a magnet, right? Where they either attract together or they repel. And there's a positive and negative, a yin and a yang, a masculine and feminine. And when two partners are on the same side of the scale, the same embodying the same primary essence, there's a lack of polarity there. You need in a relationship the dynamic of the masculine and feminine pushing and pulling on each other to create that polarity that creates the dynamic that you want in a relationship. And you pointed out that if we are both in one of those dynamics, that we're going to lose polarity.
Which we had been.
We had gone through a season of pretty good, I would say, pretty intense growth, and we'd come through a season of intimacy, growth, and enough to kind of whet our appetites, I think, knowing that there's more that we can lean into there. And we were both, I think, delighting in what we were finding in our relationship as we leaned into it. But then you came to me and said, hey, I've noticed, and this must have taken some courage on your part looking back. He's like, I've noticed that we're like, I'm a little bit more in my masculine energy and you're a little bit more in your feminine energy, you said to me. And I thought, well, that's kind of backwards, but I don't understand. And so you went on to point out how your goal was to embody more of your feminine essence, and that you had a concern that if you do that, and if you're successful in moving more into your primary feminine essence, and I'm primarily in my feminine essence, that we would lack polarity. And I thought, well, I don't want to lack polarity. I don't really like, it doesn't sound quite right to me that I'm embodying a primarily feminine essence, more chaotic, not planning, not structured, not grounded. I was reactive. I was becoming reactive to emotions rather than creating the space where the fullness of your emotions could be expressed safely and where you could flourish in that. So you called my attention to that. I hadn't noticed any of those patterns. I didn't even know that was a thing. But we had done, I guess, enough work in our relationship to create the space where we could have that conversation, where you could say, listen, I'm moving into my feminine essence. You're in your feminine essence. That's going to create a lack of polarity. Is that what you want? You want to talk about a motivation for a guy to sack up and move into his masculine essence. That's it. It's like if your woman comes to you and says that, then you're like, okay, I need to pay attention. It's like, where do I learn more about this? Okay. And it's like, that's the kind of crux of the issue is like, and that's what I want to try to elucidate today is like, what is it that spurs transformation? What is it that turns that switch where we go, aha, I see that pattern. I'd never noticed that before. Yeah, I want to do something about that. And now what to do? So it's this, I've already proven in some sense that I'm someone who can change. I can move up into these higher patterns of being. I can discover something and then change it and make something better, humbly and carefully, by navigating through that morass and coming out to a more solid, firm foundation on the other side. So that was several years ago, and we've learned a lot about the masculine and feminine energies and dynamics, and it's been a helpful framework for us to frame up some of the conversations that we have in our marriage. But you had a lot of courage in bringing that to me, and I wanted to share that with our audience as one of the examples of the kinds of ways in which relationships, in marriage relationship, can serve as a container for growth in intimacy, growth of the human flourishing to develop and take place there. And you just invited me into that. You were like, hey man, I see the king energy in you. I see the masculine in you, and I don't see you living it out. And there's something missing. And I'm going to invite you into that. I want to call you higher. And you just laid it out there. You just like, okay, here's what. So tell me, like, is that, when you think back on that time, did you have any of that kind of thought in your mind? Like, what's going to happen when we have this conversation? Because I know that when couples who are stuck in something, just talking about the thing is scary.
Well, and I mean, for that one example, I could bring up so many examples that I can think of times that you had courage to speak things into my life as well. I feel like that's a pattern that we've been able to find and, become better at. But I wish I could say that I was, wise enough to think through and know exactly. No. And sometimes that's it. Like, I probably came to you in conversation more as this is something I'm thinking about and I need to process it with somebody, and you were safe enough to be curious with me, and we kind of dove into it together. Like, I don't feel like I had even studied it that much to where like I came understanding it fully or knowing exactly what it would look like or how to, I think for me it was almost more like I was a little nervous, just like you were hearing about it, that a lack of polarity could cause people to grow apart. That was the last thing I wanted. And I started realizing I think more of it was like, I started realizing some of the unexplained or unaware patterns that we had taken on of relating to each other. Mm-hmm. Like, I think about how much of a gatekeeper in our relationship I had kind of taken on, and I didn't like how that felt, kind of back to like, I didn't like how it felt to be afraid. Once I started realizing that this was a thing and that I actually, in fact, had been living in that, and that was, more masculine in nature, and I sat with it and I was like, well, I don't like how that feels. But if I kind of start leaning into feminine and there's patterns of being where you're in your feminine, and that might mean we grow apart. Well, that didn't seem like that appealing as well. So it was like, I came to you more, I think, and it may not have felt like this to you, but I think I honestly came more as this like, hey, I'm learning about this, and what could this mean for us if we wouldn't change, but what could it mean for us if we really did, and could things be better than they are? But yeah, I remember that conversation as well.
And it struck me while you were saying that the thing that motivated you, and I've touched on this just briefly, but the thing that motivated you was love. You loved me well enough to want more for me and want more for us than what we were currently experiencing. And I think that's why this is such an important conversation, because love does pull us forward.
Right.
And it causes us to be willing to give up the parts of ourselves that are not aligned with love, that are not aligned with our higher purpose, with our higher design and calling. letting all that fall away in the interest of becoming more true, more how we were created to be, more of the person, the image of God that we were placed here on earth to be. I think that love is something that you mentioned earlier, the kind of ongoing cycle of change, right? So it's you discover that something needs to change. You go through the hard work and you change it, and you embody new habits, a new way of being, and then love shines a light on another part.
Well, and sometimes it actually happens as you're learning and growing into something. And it's fascinating. So sometimes I feel like a physical habit, bad habit, or a physical way of being is easier to change in that you see the difference in your body composition and how you feel, like physically, pain may go away, inflammation may go down. What's fascinating is to experience that in the way that you think and see how that actually makes you feel more, like your nervous system starts to calm down or regulate. And as you're in that process, sometimes literally in the middle of that process, you start to feel something else deregulate, and you're like, hold on a second, what is that? And then you start to realize, and I see that in the way that you're literally changing your physical body, is like, as you're finding one movement pattern, and you're correcting that, you kind of are leaning in and realizing, well, this is also part of that. And I think it plays into like how interconnected we are. It's really, once you start transforming in some way, you start to realize that it's really hard to separate the mental from the emotional, from the physical, and how we really are truly complex beings that are so connected. And that, yes, leaning into something that you feel or see or experience as suffering will show up something else. Mm-hmm. And that shouldn't be cause for
That's not
fear.
Reason not to do it. That's reason right. To do it.
And hopeful.
Yeah.
Like, it's life. It's hopeful.
Yeah. Well, if life is that which repeats, and you start working on, okay, let's just take, for example, here's a practical example from our past. When I would come home from work, I had a certain expectation of what I would be walking into, let's say. Like, I had a hope. I had a hope. I hoped, I had a vision for what it would be like if it was good, let's say. I had a vision that my wife would be flourishing, radiant, and at peace, and that our home would be a place of peace. And so when there was a season where I would come home from work and I would see that you were stressed, that you were dysregulated, that your face was set, your jaw was set, and there was a frown on your face.
Again, physical manifestation of probably something that was going on inside.
Yeah. And maybe the kids were, you were taking on a bunch of stress about the way that the kids were, or maybe the house or whatever. And you were, but when I came home from work, I could tell that, like something's not okay. Right. And the temptation is just to ignore that. Like, okay, well, this is an opportunity for me to just go, sit in the lazy boy, watch TV, play video games, whatever the thing is, go to the gym, go to the bar, go to the whatever, just check out. Right.
Or swoop in and try to fix it. Like, quickly, what can I do to make this not be this way, right?
Yes. And so I think what served us well is, and this is just a tiny little example, but it's like, have a conversation and just bare your heart and go, listen, hon, I'm sure that I have a lot to do with this, but I've noticed that X, Y, and Z, laying out the problem that I see, and then also laying out the desired future state, and be like, what is it that we could do together to create a future where when I come home from work,
since you're going to be coming home from work, every day.
5 days a week for the next 30 years, right? It's like we might as well get it right. Like it's not an insignificant part of our life. You know, it's like it's 10 minutes a day, every day for the rest of my life, you know.
Which makes up life.
Right. So, okay, like when I come home from work, what would I want to have happen? Well, in an ideal world, my wife would be able to pause what she's doing, at least briefly, and greet me with a smile, and I could hug her, and we could, even if it's just 30 seconds, share a brief connection, a moment of, you know, hey, I'm home, I got, you know, I'm able to help with the kids, whatever. But to enter into each other's worlds and whatever. So when we had the conversation, we just laid out that desired future state and then humbly took responsibility, both of us, for the, you know, the parts of the negative aspect of that we were creating. And then brainstorming together, like, okay, well, what would it look like for me to come home from work and for things to be peaceful and radiant and in that desired future state.
Right. And it can be a temptation for somebody hearing that to go like, I'm not enough, or this part of me is, you know, whatever. And what I want to invite the listeners to is that when you truly, as a couple, especially in this situation, believe that you are for each other, this does not come as a threat. It does not come as a competition. It does not come as this toxic, like, he needs me to be different than I am. It's this invitation to live above what you've been living. Because honestly, when I was really quiet and true to myself, I didn't like how it felt to be in this dark cloud when he came home. As much as maybe I wanted him to know that I've had a stressful day, as much as I felt like this was the only way to really have somebody feel for me, in our talking, that was part of our brainstorming, is like, how can I let you know that it's been hard and I would love some help, or I would, you know, and that is part of the conversation, but you can't have it if you don't have an aim. You can't have, like, how do you even have an aim unless you have those conversations and go, like, somebody, which you were the one courageous enough to go, this is my vision for our family. We both want peace. This is an unpeaceful part of our family right now, is when I come home from work and things are dark and stormy, even if it's been a hard day. And so for me, it was like, okay, how can I, even if it's 5 minutes before and the house is a mess, how can I make sure that I feel good, smell good, and at least look presentable, and am in a state of mind where when you walk through the door, I have the ability to stop and greet you and be pleasant.
Because then you can invite me into participating with whatever it is that you need help with, and I'm not tempted to resentment. And I'm, you know, this goes both ways, right? It's like I couldn't have that conversation if I wasn't willing to participate in the solution and to take responsibility for the parts of that I could influence and own up to the darker aspects of what exists that I'm responsible for. And we had just relatively recently, we had a conversation where I think we've kind of gotten this to a place where we can have these conversations with each other in a much shorter context than it used to be, like kind of okay. So, you know that I'm a blind and stupid idiot. And so, lay it all out. It's like, and here's what I'm hoping for. And is there something that maybe we could, participate in together? And it's like, no, we can, because we have that basis, we can kind of lean into it. And I noticed that what was tempting for you sometimes was if things in the family weren't the way you wanted them to be, something wasn't getting done, or you were stressed or whatever. It's like there's this kind of dark feminine energy that would just manifest itself, and everybody was on pins and needles, like kind of looking around like, what could I do to make things better? It's like, maybe if I quickly, maybe if I wash the dishes and maybe if I, put this away, it's like.
And I could sense it from the kids as soon as they would take that on. It was like all of a sudden things got done. It was very effective.
And it's effective. Yeah, right. It's like, and so I think kind of jokingly, but also humbly, truly said like, look, I see what's going on here. It's like, this is really effective for you to put out this kind of unspecified, dark feminine energy. It's very effective at getting things done. But I said it would be much easier on all of our nervous systems if you were able to specify what it is that you need help with
that I'm
and
stressed
invite
about
us into it so that we could prevent that from leaking all over the house,
And the kids all agreed with him when we brought it up.
It's like, would you be willing to specify what it is that you need help with specifically so that we'd be cheerfully helping you?
What's the country song? I just want to be mad for a while. I think.
Yeah.
But maybe that's what I specify some days. It's like, well, right now I just want to be mad.
I need you to go away and give me a little space.
No, it was very helpful. Yeah. And yeah.
And, but you've pointed out how I do that too. And there's these kind of little passive aggressive little modes of being that, well, if I don't bother, because that's the thing. It's like, if I don't sit down with my own discomfort and sit with it and figure out what exactly is irritating me, then I won't know what's irritating me. And I'll just put out these passive aggressive, bitter little sniping, and maybe I'll get lucky and people will figure out what I'm pissed about and fix it. Maybe they won't, but I'm brooding and mad and and it's like.
And back to what you said at the start of the podcast was, it also keeps you from having to take responsibility.
Right.
And transform. And so, yes, having somebody in relationship who's courageous enough and then having the marriage that's safe enough to bring things up to each other, and then for both to take the responsibility for whatever it is that you're suffering in and grow together and change together. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And I just today in church, actually, the pastor said something. I wrote it down and I'm going to try to say it from memory, but creation always comes about. So creation always comes about from intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about, obviously, the way that life is conceived, first of all, but even, whenever there's creation, there's some sort of intimacy, and busyness is the enemy of intimacy. And so I think, busyness, be that refusal to stop and think, stop our thoughts and be quieted and think, or busyness in a relationship or whatever. But I think in order to create a new thing, there has to be some sort of intimacy, either with yourself, with God, with each other. It's like, quiet yourself. Be willing to talk. Be willing to be vulnerable. Be willing to be intimate with yourself, with God, with each other, in order to create something new that you want.
That's a great point. I love that. I think that out of that intimacy for us, well, that's part of what created the container that was safe enough for us to invite each other into those areas of growth, I think. And our story, when going back 5 years ago, when we first had the conversation, when I first asked you that question, do you know what it's like to feel like there's so much about you that has to change and that you don't know where to start? For me, I couldn't even talk to you at that point about what I was struggling with most. I didn't have the courage yet to tell you that I had been addicted to porn and that I'd been unfaithful and that I'd had a life full of sin and addiction to destructive behaviors. I thought that was the main thing I needed to change. And I guess in some ways that was the main thing. But honestly, by volume, I'd say it was probably about 10%, and to discover after that changed, to discover that 95% of the rest of me had to go as well and be made new. Like that was something. I mean, I guess I kind of knew it. That's kind of what I was saying, is I don't even know where to start. I don't know if I should start with, like, okay. And it was leading up to New Year's, so I was thinking about New Year's resolutions. It's like, where do I start? Do I start with the weight loss? Do I start with not being broke? Do I start with not cheating? Do I start with not looking at porn? Do I start with not lying? Do I start, you name it. Where do you start if you're that jacked up?
And you were not even aware at that point how much was tied to each other. Like,
yeah,
how much your physical manifestations, the pain you were feeling in your physical body, in your knee, in your back, your herniated discs, were actually related to some of those things.
Yeah. And you start pulling the thread, you're like, you just pull that thread and you pull it long enough and things start to come apart, and then you can put it back together again.
And even in my life, like, I think about how the courage you had to start naming those things and to start looking at them truly was a portal of healing for our family, like for the transformation for the rest of us to start noticing patterns in our own lives and in our own. And I want to speak to the listeners again, speak to the masculine, to the men out there. Like, I don't think men understand how beautiful and how powerful it is when they can courageously include their families into some of those painful parts of their lives, and then have them observe you walk through that and change. I mean, the kids, like every one of the kids are different people as well.
Yeah.
Over the past 5 years.
Well, one of the things that has changed is our relationship with our kids, and the relationship, especially with the kids as they get older, as they step into their own responsibilities, and the fullness of who they are begins to emerge. I think the leadership that men can show in their families and being willing to sacrifice in that way, and to name the things about them that are unworthy, that need to burn away, that need to be cut away. Naming those things, I think that's so powerful. And as the leader in the home, I think, as the man, I think that's, if you're going to lead by example on anything, start there. That self-sacrificial love that says, I see a brighter future. I'm willing to sacrifice myself to get to it. And in a way, that's one of the things that's so beautiful about God and his story is it's not someone else that needs to get cut away for us to move forward. It's not someone else's, there's not a scapegoat out there. It's like Jesus bore the fullness of the burden, carrying that. And so all I need to give up is my own perception of it, my own clinging to the wrong story. Like, I don't need to get a new wife or a new family.
On your own. Sometimes that is the right thing to do, but why is it so hard to name it and actually confess it out?
I think for me, the reason that naming, why it's not only so powerful, but also so challenging, is because it kind of goes to what we said earlier, where it's easier just to be mad at this kind of general thing. It's like, well, I don't like that I'm fat, or I don't like that I'm in pain, or I don't like that, to break that down and go, okay, well, what precisely needs to change? Oh, I need to stop eating, ice cream every night before I go to bed, and I need to stop doing X, Y, and Z that's hurting me in this way. It's like, when you actually name it, well, now I'm responsible to do the dang thing. It's like, who wants that?
Right.
It's a lot easier just to keep it in the cloud, keep it in the dark, and just be generally upset about it.
Which usually causes it to grow.
Yeah, it does cause it to grow, doesn't it? Yeah. But getting to kind of the practical elements of putting together a plan, like Like when you become aware of a problem, you've named it, and you really want to, you're motivated by love to change it. Not out of shame or not out of self-hatred, but really genuinely you have a vision of a brighter future and you want to move towards it. How do you approach that? How do you put a plan in place? Is there an example or something specific you can think of?
Well, I think naming it is a big part of it. And then, well, sometimes it is, for me, it is coming up with an aim. But like when I think of even small things, like this is super practical and super easy. Like I wish I would read more. I wish I could read more. Well, okay, that's a wish. That's a dream. The lie I had believed for years was, well, I'm too busy. I don't have time to sit down and read this book. And thanks to a practice that we did, 75 Hard, that we went through, I started to realize that if I sit down for 20 minutes and read 10 pages a day in a book, I get through a lot of books in a year. Mm-hmm. And so finding maybe the smallest ways of being able to lean into that, or like when you came to me and said, when I come home, so what's the smallest thing I can do there? Well, I can at least, if the house isn't completely clean, I can at least be presentable myself and have a smile on my face. And I remember a few weeks ago or a few months ago, I was picking you up at the airport late at night and I started feeling like anxious I don't know why. I just had this like pattern of when I was alone in the car and I was coming to pick you up, I started realizing that so often by the time I get to the airport, I'm a mess. I haven't seen you for a week because you're traveling. There's all these things I want to talk about. And I just am this like bundle of nerves. And I didn't like that. I didn't like how it felt. And I didn't like to be that person when you show up. And so I remember I was driving down the road and I was like, well, I don't know how to stop thinking about these things. But if I soften my face and smile, at least like I'll look the part. And maybe some people would say, well, that's kind of escaping from your thoughts. But no, I was changing my nervous system at that point. And honestly, 5 minutes later, I just looked silly in my car. I was sitting there smiling. 5 minutes later, like the bundle of nerves had just dissipated. Like I wasn't a bundle of nerves anymore. And was able then, if there were truly things that were bothering me, able to talk about them in a way that actually didn't feel bad to me or to you. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but I don't even know really if there is one practical thing that I would say is to do.
Well, you lined up the approach really nicely, which is it's almost like coming up with a theory. It's like, here's a problem. Here's the desired future state. It's like, I don't know for sure what all the inputs are that I need to change, or what do I need to do or stop doing. But let me try this. And you mentioned like affect change at the smallest or lowest resolution level and then go from there.
It's like, just overwhelming if you try to get it from the big part. Like you just don't get it done then. Right. If I try to get a book that I want to read and try to read it all in one day, well, yeah, you're right. My day is shot. I didn't get anything done I was supposed to. I didn't, so that feels overwhelming to me.
Yeah. So it's like, it's all the way down to the very practical, like, I think if my goal is to become a reader, I can foresee a future like tomorrow where I could carve out 7 minutes a day to read. If I were to have, can I do 7 minutes? No. Okay. Do I have 5 minutes? Okay. Start with what you have. It's like, well, probably once you're reading for 5 minutes, you're probably going to read for 7. And some days you might even go to 10. And then you're like, oh, it's like, yeah. And if you keep stringing that together, in a month or two, you're a reader, right? And you're reading. It's like you have there's a new present reality. I think in relationships, it's the same thing. It's you find this, like, if I did this little thing different, I have this theory that perhaps this would gesture towards that brighter future, that I desire. And so when you do that and then you see a little bit of the fruit as a result of that, you're like, yeah, that does seem to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that builds in you this faith that if I keep showing up in this way, I'm going to continue to grow in this way. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of navigate to a brighter future. We don't get there all in one fell swoop,
right.
but we navigate there by paying attention and noticing what's working and what's not working, noticing what's making us feel anxious and what's making us feel peaceful. Notice what directs us towards love versus what, fractures us and puts us in disarray.
And I think we are such a fast-paced society right now, and we are so accustomed to instant gratification that sometimes that slow process just feels like we're not getting anywhere. I mean, even like finances, any of the professionals or the gurus would say, well, if you start by, even if you can just save $10 out of every 100, that's saving 10 that you're not spending, right? That you're putting aside that you're going to have for the future. Even if you can't do 50, where so often we think, well, if we want to get rich, we have to be saving at least $90 and only spending 10. Well, that may not even be feasible in your current situation. And so I think with anything, if there's a problem that, especially if it's been something that you've been suffering in or a bad habit that you've held on to for a long time. I remember when we were with our Lyme battle, for instance, and we started trying to figure out how to clean up our diet because we'd been told that we really have to cut out, 90% of what we'd been eating, like processed foods and sugars. And I remember one of the nutritionalists that we were going to at the time, she was very wise in saying, I don't want you to go home, MJ, and empty your cupboards, even though what I've told you today will tempt you to do that. Finish what you have, and instead of buying, processed flour the next time, buy some einkorn or buy some whole wheat, or instead of buying processed sugar, get some coconut sugar, or, so replace things slowly so that it's not this like upset the fruit basket and 10 days in, I'm like, I don't even know what's up and I'm just giving up completely.
Yeah. And this works. This is really important in relationship dynamics, is that idea of starting with the kind of smallest thing, is because it's tempting when you're in a relationship and something's not right. Something doesn't work the way that you hoped it would. And maybe for both of you, it's tempting to let that cloud the way you see the whole relationship, to let it leak into everything. You're like, my frustration about this little thing, because I haven't taken the time to notice and specify to myself and to my partner exactly what it is that's frustrating me, instead I just let that leak out into everything. Right. And then it's like, you always and you never. It's like, really? Are you? It's like, seriously. How do you fix that? It's kind of like the problem with, you see the climate panic. It's like climate change, and we need to fix the climate. It's like, what is that? And who needs to fix it? And what precisely do they need to do? It's like, well, let's start with what's the climate. And when you start realizing the complexity of what is the climate, then you realize, like, no government edict is going to fix whatever we might think is wrong with the climate. It's like, that doesn't mean there's not things we can do to ensure a bright future. No, but it starts from the bottom up, not from the top down. It starts with a process that's oriented towards humble and truthful discovery, not a prideful and totalitarian top-down assumption about what's wrong.
Responsibility. It's humble, right?
It's starting. It's
Humility.
Like, let's start with the smallest thing and have the conversation in the smallest, like, about the most constrained element of what you're talking about, and see if you can improve that. It's like, maybe it is the 5 minutes surrounding me walking in the door that we really want to focus on. And we had the same conversation about, like, bedtime. What are some bedtime routines that are life-giving for both of us? And how do we end up getting into bed at about the right time, and where both of our bodies, emotional systems, nervous systems, mental energy, all of that is aligned to a healthy night's rest. It's like, that means that like we can be intentional about that.
Right.
We can design our day and our evening in such a way that it ends with us being ready for bed at a certain time and in a certain state of mind. It's like, you can plan for that.
Right. And that doesn't go to say that there's not seasons of like struggle and times of hard conversations and things. Because one of the things for us at bedtime that we realized is like, if we didn't connect during the day, we were often tempted to try to have hard conversations as we were falling asleep, which then one of us would
demanding.
One of us would end up not being able to sleep for a while.
Yep.
So, well, how can we change that? And that doesn't mean that you don't have the conversations,
right,
and that you ignore. No, but we can still talk about the problem and find a solution.
Yeah. And I think for us, that was, I remember, I think we literally came to a place where like, is this something that we need to talk about right now? Or is this something that we can talk about tomorrow morning? Can we get, is this emotionally demanding thing that could end up causing stress hormones to course through my body and make sure I'm awake for the next 3 hours? Is this something that has to happen now, or can it happen tomorrow morning?
And I'll just say, for me as the feminine, because I was often the one that was bringing up something hard to talk about, I'll just walk through a little bit of what went through my mind. So it was tempting for me to go, I'm too much. He's just pushing me off. He's not holding space for me. All of these things. And that's where, again, knowing that you're for each other, knowing that it wasn't that I was too much, it allowed triggers to come up for me that I got to work through. And I could either have reacted, and I did sometimes, like, go dark for a while, or go, okay, we'll get up tomorrow morning, and I'm not going to punish you by making you bring it up. I may even have to be the one the next morning to go, hey, babe, do you have time, or when do you have time today in your day to hold the conversation that we were about to have last night? Mm-hmm. Instead of, believing the lies that I was tempted to believe because of thought patterns I had. I'm not enough. I'm too much. I'm just being pushed aside, all of these things, whatever the patterns were. Allow yourself to sit with the triggers, and instead of letting them just be real to you, realize that it's giving you an opportunity to grow and let go of and release and all of that. But again, it takes allowing things to become conscious and not just let subconscious thought patterns into your mind. And
one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about how to initiate sustained growth and change in our life, one of the reasons I wanted to make that a topic of today's discussion is because I need more of this in my life. I need, to your point, it's like there's always something on the horizon. And for me, it's this right here, what we're doing now. My past is full of starting things and then stopping them again because I get excited about something and I get all fired up and it's all this energy and then peters out and I just drop it and I move on to the next thing. One hobby, interest, whatever it is, it's just I go hard and then I'm done. I go hard into it and then I'm done. It's like, that's not a good pattern. That's not a healthy pattern. That's not the pattern of a man that's deeply grounded in his masculine essence and knows what he's about and knows what he wants and goes and does it. And so I know that that's something that I want to change. And I think I see areas in my life that's changing, but one area that it hasn't changed is in my creative practice. And this podcast is a part of that creative practice. So there's a kind of unavoidable gap in between episodes 4 and 5. It's like I recorded episode 4 and then I got stuck. I ran into some technical issue and I didn't know how to fix it, or I didn't know how to move on, so I just left it. And every time I thought about, you should do something creative, there's this thing calling to me. It's like, you have something to say, you need to say it. It's like, well, okay, so the place where I say it let's say, is on my podcast. And my podcast right now, I'm waiting to edit episode 5. But I'm stuck with this technical challenge. It's like, and then eventually enough time goes by to where I'm like, screw it. It would be embarrassing at this point now. 3 months have gone by since episode 4. It's too embarrassing. I'm not even going to put episode 5 out there because what will people think? Yada, yada, yada. It's like, and so pushing through that into, like, I want to develop the rhythms of, like, I want this podcast to be on a regular schedule. I want it to come out. It's not my main thing. It's just a side thing, but it's an important part of my creative voice that I'm exercising, and I need to do it. And creating the patterns in my life that make sure that this gets done, that desire is what caused me to want to spend a little time drilling down on this and understanding, well, how do I initiate sustained growth? How have I, with my fitness and my weight and my spiritual and emotional and mental health, how have I, like, what are the ways in which I've seen growth that's been sustained over years in your life and in my life and in our marriage and in our family and our communities? Like, spending time, like, drilling down on that is why it's like, okay, like, here's what I need to do to fix this, or to make this more full, or to make this flourish. I think that's what drew my attention to it, is this stumbling, faltering podcast process that I'm in. Is, I don't know exactly why I feel compelled to put this together. It's not like it's making money that we need to live on. I have a day job for that. But I feel compelled for some reason to do it. And I know that when I don't do it, I'm being less than what I've perceived that I could be, I guess. And so there's a part of me that wants to do it. I don't know where that part is day in and day out for the past 3 months that the podcast has sat untouched. There's another pattern in my life. It's like the podcast was untouched, while the $1,500 worth of podcast gear that I just bought sat here unused too. I think we do that with, like, exercise equipment and, gym electronics and gym memberships and whatever. It's like, well, maybe I can just spend some money and fix the problem. It's like, turns out you still need to build the personal, like, you still need to build the habits and the practices that sustain the transformation. So that's,
and I love how the word practice is gentle, because it really is what it is we are practicing, we are becoming. It's rarely that you just become,
right,
or that you just achieve. It's like, it takes these practices, it takes these repeated practices to actually accomplish and become, and along the way you learn, and you keep becoming.
I think that's a great place to stop for today. Thank you for sharing all your thoughts on your own transformation, and thank you for being my sidekick as we journey through this wonderful story together.
It's a wonderful wild ride for sure.
Thank you, folks. That's episode 6 of the Urban Amish Show, personal growth and transformation. We'd love to hear from you, and would love if you would be so kind as to share this episode with someone who you think might benefit from it. I'm going to work at building a sustained practice of creative output that will lead to a more regular publishing of this podcast. So,
and the world will be better because of it.
thank you, my love.